Hello, welcome to Zigmatech Learning Hub. I'll be your instructor for biology. For this class, we are going to be taking our exercises from the ExamGuide app. Now, if you don't already have this installed in your device, I would like you to download the app in order to follow along in this class. Now, ExamGuide is a leading educational app that helps students prepare adequately for various exams. Exams such as the UTME, the post-UTME, WAEC, GCE, IJMB, KCPE, JUPEB, Calbepedia. In the junior sections, we also have the BECE, we have the SSCE, and so much more. Now, you can download the app from www.examguide.com or you visit the Google Play Store to download. Now, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to update yourselves on new videos that will be coming up. Now, if you're ready for this class, let's get started. Have you ever wondered why we breathe in air? You know, 1,000 times we take in air and we breathe out air, and most of us really don't understand or know the reason why we're taking air. Humans can't actually survive without this air being taken in and out. Try it some other time, please, but be very careful when you're doing this. Close your nostrils and try not to breathe in air for some time. You will see that gradually you will begin to pass out. The reason is simple. Air is very important. So we're going to be looking and exploring a lot of reasons why we're taking air. We're going to be looking at the reasons for breathing or gaseous exchange, or in other words, we can call it respiration. Now, the topic we're going to be looking at today is called respiratory system. Respiratory system. And we're going to look at a whole lot of things about respiratory system. I promise you it's going to be an exciting one. Now, let's take a look at some of the objectives we have here, or some of the things we're going to be looking at under this particular topic. Now, by the end of this class or this topic, you should be able to give a proper definition of respiration. And I'm going to explain more reasons why I said a proper definition of respiration. And also by the end of this class or this topic, you should be able to describe the different types of respiratory systems we have, and you should be able to outline some of the conditions. There are several conditions that are necessary for respiration to actually occur in any living organism. And then finally, we're going to be looking at how to explain some of the mechanisms of respiration that is found in some lower organisms. Now, if you're set, let's take a look at some of this. Definition of respiration. Now, the term respiratory system involves a whole lot of things. Now, before I go into the definition of respiration, give me a little time. Let me explain the word respiratory system. Now, if you could remember a topic being taught, which is called levels of organizations of life. We have what we call 4 levels of organizations of life. We have the cells, we have the tissues, we have the organs, and then we have the system. Now, if you know the definition of the organs, we said that organs are simply aggregates of tissues which come together and they perform a particular function. In the same manner, systems can be defined as aggregates of organs which come together and they carry out a particular function. Now, if we relate this to respiratory system, we can define respiratory system as aggregates of organs which come together to carry out the sole function of respiration. To carry out the sole function of respiration. And we're going to be looking at several organs that are responsible for respiration to really occur. Now, earlier when we started this topic, when I was mentioning the specific objective, I made mention of one of the objectives as definition of respiration. And I specifically said, I'm going to give you a proper definition of respiratory system. Now, in your primary class, in your basic, I think 4, 5, and also basic 3, you might have heard that respiration simply has to do with the breathing in of air and also the breathing out of air. Now, that is not wrong. That is actually an aspect of respiration. It is an aspect of respiration. And then when you get to your junior secondary schools or classes, you are also taught another definition of respiration, of which you were told that respiration is just the oxidation of food substances in order to release energy. Now, that is also not wrong, also correct. But if you look at it, respiration, what that definition is simply talking about aerobic respiration. It is actually explaining only one type of respiration. And then the first one I gave is only explaining one stage of respiration. As time continues in this particular topic, we're going to be looking at some of the types of respiration. We're also going to be looking at the stages or the phases of respiration. We have actually two phases, and also we have two types, all right? Now, a proper definition of respiration can be given as this. Respiration can simply be defined as the process by which complex food substances or molecules are broken down by series of chemical reactions which are controlled by enzymes in order to release energy. Now, the reason why I added series of chemical reactions is because in anaerobic respiration, it does not involve the use of oxygen. It doesn't involve the use of oxygen. It, in fact, involves the use of an enzyme. It involves the use of enzymes, which are usually produced by some microorganisms. Okay? So, a better definition that houses or covers every aspect of respiration you might have learned in your lower education is this. Respiration, one more time, can be defined as the process by which food substances are broken down by series of chemical reactions which are controlled by enzymes in order to release energy. Now, if you look at the definition we just gave, we said it is in order to release energy. So the major purpose for respiration is to release energy. And this energy that is released is actually used to carry out various processes of life, or we can say it is used to carry out metabolic activities of life. We are actually going to be looking at some of these importance of energy. We're looking at some of these importance of energy. Now, one of the major importance of energy is the need, or energy is actually needed for transportation of essential materials within the body. Now, there are several essential materials that are moved from one part of the body, actually where they are produced, to certain parts of the body where they are needed. We have essential materials like digested food. We have essential materials like enzymes. We also have examples like the hormones. We have oxygen, which we breathe in. Now, these are some of the things, even excretory waste. These are some of the essential materials that are being transported in animals. There are also essential materials transported in plants. We have manufactured food. We have gases, which has to do with oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. We also have excretory waste. We also have hormones, and also we have enzymes. They are being transported from one point to another in the body. Now, the transport media, mostly in animals, is usually the lymph and the blood. And that of the plant cells, or actually plant, is the cell sap or latex. So it simply means energy is needed to move these things from one place to another. If you compare it to our social life, you need energy to move several goods and actually services which has to do with us from one place to another. And that energy is gotten from fuels, okay? The petroleum we use, or the petrol gases, and so on, the diesel. These are sources of energy that helps to drive mechanical engines that will carry essential materials, even goods and services, from one place to another. In the same manner, it happens in the body. Energy is also required for the transportation of these essential materials within the body. Now, another important importance of energy to living organism is for movement. For movement. Have you ever tried moving or running or walking about when you have not eaten for, let's say, you were doing a fast for 7 days? How was the rate of your movement? You'll find out that the rate of movement, your rate of movement will actually be slow, and you'll be tired moving around. Now, that is simply because energy is not what produced. Movement is simply the change of the position of the body from one place to another. Now, plants don't actually locomote, which has to do with the change of the whole organism from one place to another. Plants only move part of their body. However, moving part of the body and also moving the whole of the body from one place to another requires energy. It actually does require energy. So we need energy for what? Movement. We need energy for movement, both in plants as well as in animals. Also, number 3, energy is important and needed or required for the maintenance of body temperature with heat energy. See, the heat energy is needed to maintain body temperature. And of course, we have different types of organisms based on body temperature. We have the poikilothermic, and then we also have the homeothermic. Poikilothermic simply means the cold-blooded, and the homeothermic, which has to do with the warm-blooded. In fact, the maintenance of body temperature is essential for survival. Very essential for survival. And one of the things, or one of the factors actually required to maintain this body temperature is actually energy in the form of heat energy. Number 4 is that it is required for reproduction. Energy is required for reproduction. The sperm cells, which are the gametes, the male gametes and the female gamete, the sperm cell actually needs energy. If you look at the structure of the sperm cell, you will see that it has a head, it has a middle piece, and then it has a tail or a flagellum. Now, the middle piece is made up of an organelle called the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria is discovered to be the powerhouse of the cell. It means it is the site for cellular respiration, or the site for the production of energy. So it means that, excuse me, the sperm cells actually needs energy to swim to the egg cell. If the sperm cells doesn't have enough energy to swim to the egg cell, reproduction can never be in place. So reproduction is possible when energy is needed, or energy is what? Produced or released. So energy is an essential factor required for what? Reproduction, both in plants as well as also in animals. Okay? Now, another thing again that is another importance of respiration, or importance of energy for living organisms, is that energy is important in excretion. Excretion has to do with the removal of metabolic waste or toxic waste from the body. Now, every time the body carries out metabolism, which has to do with the sum total of all the activities that goes on within the body, there are always waste generated. In the same manner, in your workplace, after working, there is always waste generated. In school, there is always waste generated. Papers, liters of papers. If you go to the furniture house, you have liters of wood dust and so many other things that are littered. Every workplace generates waste. The same manner, in your body, there are several activities or workings, things that are going on part-time every moment. And because there is always work Your body is always at work, carrying out metabolic activities. Waste are always generated. Now, if these wastes are left inside of the body, they become poisonous or toxic to the body. And in order to remove these waste, energy is required. So we need energy to remove waste product of metabolism from the body. Okay, so these are some of the reasons or importance of energy. Another importance of energy to living organism is that energy is required in the transmission of nerve impulses and coordinations. Transmission of nerve impulses and coordinations. Now, if I should bring a hot iron close to your skin and touch your skin, actually, you feel the pain, you feel the heat. Now, what makes you feel the heat is simply that there are what we call sensory nerve cells. Now, these sensory nerve cells receives this impulse or signals and transmits them to your brain. The energy is required for this transmission or this movement to the brain. So it is transmitted to your brain interprets it and sends a reply or sends a response to your effector organs, which has to do with your muscles for it to retract or pull out from that hot object, okay? To pull out the arm rather, from that hot object. Now, the energy for these nerve cells, the energy required for these nerve cells to move from where they receive the impulse or the signal or the pain to the brain and then backwards, back again to the effector organs requires energy. And this energy comes from respiration. Energy comes from respiration. Now, there are several conditions that are necessary for respiration to occur. Now, respiration don't just take place. There are several things that must be in place in all living organisms, mostly animals, that must be in place for respiration to actually occur. Now, let's take a look at some of these conditions. Number one, the first one is respiratory medium. Respiratory medium. Now, what is actually the respiratory medium? Respiratory medium simply means the surroundings of an organism from which oxygen is obtained. The surrounding of an organism from which oxygen is obtained. Now, if you take a critical look at this surrounding from which oxygen can be obtained as animals or as living organisms, it's simply from air and water. So the two main examples of respiratory medium are air and water. The second condition necessary for respiration to take place is that there must be a respiratory organ. We will be talking in details about respiratory organs much later in this particular topic. There must be a respiratory organ. A respiratory organ is actually an organ that carries out the process of what? Respiration, or carries out gaseous exchange. When we say gaseous exchange, we simply means the taking in of oxygen and then the giving out of what? Carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide. So this exchange is done between most times respiratory organs. And we have a whole lot of different types of respiratory organs in all living organisms. And we're going to be looking at that much more later, the different types of respiratory organs found in some living organisms. Now, another thing again, another important factor or condition that is actually necessary for respiration to take place is the respiratory, there must be a respiratory surface. There must be a respiratory surface. Now, a respiratory surface is the surface of the body, mostly of the organ, where gaseous exchange takes place. I repeat, it is the surface of the body of the organ where gaseous exchange takes place. So we have several types of respiratory surfaces, and we're going to be looking at some of them much later. We're going to also look at some of the characteristics of some respiratory surfaces. Now, but before we go to some characteristics of respiratory surfaces, let's look at other conditions that are necessary for respiration to actually occur. The fourth one is called transport medium. there must be a transport medium. Now, what is the major function of the transport medium? Is to actually carry this oxygen from where they are produced or where they are gotten from and take them to the tissues and to the cells where they are being used. Remember, we've just talked about one of the importance of energy. We said it is needed for what? Transportation of essential materials. Now, this transport medium, mostly in animals, the transport medium is usually mainly the blood. So the blood carries essential materials. Now, as it relates to respiration, the blood carries oxygen from the lungs to other parts of the cells, to other parts of the body, to the cells, to the tissues, where they are being used up in order to produce what? Energy, or to release energy. So it is very vital that every respiratory surface, in fact, every respiratory organ should have enough supply of transport medium. And this transport medium, they go through what we call transport vessels. And these transport vessels, we have them as, they're also called blood vessels, which include the veins, the arteries, as well as what? The capillaries. In fact, more of the capillaries, because it is actually the capillaries that supplies these essential materials to the cells as well as the tissues. So it means that one of the conditions that is necessary for respiration to actually take place is there must be enough supply of capillaries containing blood. Okay, and then finally is that the next one, which is the last one, is ventilation. Ventilation. The last condition necessary for respiration to occur is ventilation. Now, what is ventilation? It is simply the movement of air or water over respiratory surfaces. Movement of air or water over respiratory surfaces. Now, if there is no ventilation, there will be accumulation of carbon dioxide in a particular place. For instance, if I am breathing in air and breathing out air, if there is no ventilation, the amount or the level of carbon dioxide in that my surrounding will be increased, and that will become toxic to that human being. So one other important condition for proper respiration to take place is there must be what? Ventilation. Free movement of air or water over respiratory surfaces. This helps to replenish accumulated carbon dioxide with fresh oxygen in water as well as also in air. So please take note these important 4 conditions that are necessary for respiration to occur. Now, one of the conditions I mentioned was respiratory surfaces. Now, let's take a look at some of the characteristics of respiratory surfaces. Some of these questions, these things I'm talking about, usually show up most times in WAEC past questions. Look at characteristics of respiratory surfaces. Now, we have number one characteristics of respiratory surface is it must be moist. It must be moist. Now, the reason is that gases diffuse through moist environment. So every respiratory surface must be moist. It must be moist. Number 2 is that it must have adequate supply of transport medium. Adequate supply of transport medium. Number 3, like remember I've told you about transport medium, they must be adequately supplied with transport medium. That means there must be adequate supply of capillaries containing blood. And number 3, it must have large surface area to volume ratio. In fact, the rate of diffusion is increased when the surface area to volume ratio is large. Diffusion increases when surface area to volume ratio increases. So there must be large surface area to volume ratio for easy diffusion of these gases. And number 4, it must be permeable. That means it must be able to allow gases to pass in and out of them. It must be permeable to allow gases to pass in and out of them. And then finally, number 5, it must have large surface area to aid easy. Okay, we've mentioned that it must have large surface area to aid easy diffusion of gases. Now let's take a look at some of the types of respiration. Types of respiration. Remember, I told you we're going to be looking at some of the phases of respiration, and we're also going to be looking at types of respiration. And I told you before that the definition of respiration was not correct if you are only defining aerobic respiration, which is one of the type of respiration. So we have two major types of respiration. Number one is aerobic respiration, and number two is anaerobic respiration. Now let's take a look at what aerobic respiration is all about. The name aero means air. So it means this is a type of respiration that involves the use of what? Oxygen. It involves the use of oxygen. Aerobic. Aero. It talks about air. So aerobic respiration is the type of respiration in which oxygen is required to break down complex food substances like glucose in order to release water, carbon dioxide, and energy in the form of ATP. Please take note of this. In the form of ATP. Now, what is ATP? ATP simply means adenosine triphosphate. ATP can be defined as the form in which energy is produced in the cells, stored and used up by the cells. I repeat, ATP is the form in which energy is being produced, stored, and then used up in the cells. So that is what ATP is. So anytime you see the word ATP, as well, when we're discussing respiration, it's simply talking about energy. Energy. So that's the chemical equation that proves or shows or represents aerobic respiration. The second type of respiration is the anaerobic respiration. Now, anaerobic respiration is actually a type of respiration that does not require oxygen to break down glucose in order to release energy. Now, we have different types of an anaerobic respiration. We have what we call the lactic acid fermentation, which is also a type of anaerobic respiration. We also have the alcohol fermentation. Now, note a big difference between aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Now, during aerobic respiration, remember that we said the byproducts are carbon dioxide, water, and then ATP. But in terms of anaerobic respiration, the byproducts this time, they are alcohol, carbon dioxide, as well as ATP. Now, these are major striking differences between anaerobic respiration and aerobic respiration. Now, back to the types of anaerobic respiration. Remember, we said we have the lactic acid fermentation, and then we have the alcohol fermentation. Now let's take a look at the lactic acid fermentation. Now the lactic acid fermentation occurs in some bacteria, mostly anaerobic bacteria, and you can also see it occurring in the muscles of man. Now during strenuous exercises, mostly in man, enough energy is not supplied. In fact, enough energy is not supplied, yes, because enough oxygen is not produced to break down glucose in order to release enough energy. Now, once this thing happens, the lactic acid begins to form. Once there is no enough oxygen being produced as to break down glucose, what is being produced in the muscles is usually lactic acid. Now, if this lactic acid accumulates in the muscles, it leads to what we call muscle fatigue and muscle cramps. Hence, glucose is broken down into lactic acid, like I've said, with small amount of energy that is being released. Small amount of energy is being released. And the reason why lactic acid is produced and small amount of energy is produced, I said, it is because of insufficient supply of oxygen. Now, what also happens during alcohol fermentation? Alcohol fermentation. Now, alcohol fermentation is a situation where Complex food substances, mostly glucose, is broken down into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and little amount of energy is also produced. Now, the breaking down of this glucose is most times carried out by a microorganism which we call yeast. Yeast secretes or produces a kind of enzyme that helps in breaking down alcohol, and that enzyme is called zymes. So that is alcohol fermentation. So please take note, during alcohol fermentation, alcohol is produced. During lactic acid fermentation, lactic acid is also what? Produced. Now the next thing to take note of is different organisms and their respiratory systems. Different organisms and their respiratory systems. Now we have a whole lot of organisms and they have different respiratory systems. Number one is unicellular organisms, and the unicellular organism I'm actually majoring on is a protist, which we all know as the amoeba or the amoeba. Now the respiratory organ of the amoeba is its entire body surface. The entire body surface is the respiratory organ of the amoeba or most unicellular organisms. Another organism we have is HYDRA and TAPEWORM. HYDRA and TAPEWORM. Now, the respiratory surface or organ of HYDRA as well as TAPEWORM is their cell membrane. Their cell membrane. We also have earthworm. The respiratory organ of earthworm is its entire body surface. The entire body surface serves as the respiratory organ. In fact, it is called wet skin because the skin of the tapeworm is usually wet. In fact, you can say it is the wet skin or the entire body surface of the earthworm that is called or referred to as its respiratory organ. We also have the fish. The fish, the respiratory organ of the fish is the gills. We're going to be discussing in details about the gills. So we have the gills as the respiratory organ of the fish. We also have in insects, the respiratory organ of insects is the tracheal system. The tracheal system. And also for arachnids, examples of arachnids, we have the spiders, we have the scorpions and so on, the ticks, they fall under arachnids. Now their respiratory organ, mostly the spider, is the long book. Long book. In some books you also see it as book lungs. So whichever way, long book or book lungs is still correct. Then we also have for amphibians. Amphibians, their respiratory organ is in several ways. We have, for amphibians, we have the mouth, we have the skin, and the lungs, mostly for adult amphibians, mostly the toad. For adult toad, it is the skin, it is the lungs, and then what? The mouth. These are their respiratory organ. But if it is the young toad, which is called the tadpole, the respiratory organ of tadpole is the gills. The gills. So it respires the same way the fish does. And then we also have for reptiles, the respiratory organ of a reptile is the lungs. They have their own lungs, similar to that of the human lungs. We also have the birds. The birds also, which is the aves, their respiratory organ is also lungs. And then mammals, which include humans, the respiratory organs of mammals is the lungs. And then flowering plants. Flowering plants have their own respiratory organ. In fact, there are two. We have the stomata and the lenticel. The stomata is found on the leaves, while the lenticel is usually found on the stems. Okay, so stomata and lenticel. Now, this brings us to the end of this particular topic on respiratory system 1. But before we go, let's take a look at some questions, some JAMB questions. Well, JAMB is almost coming up. So let's look at some few questions relating to what we have just discussed. Take a look at these ones. Let's go. Now, we have several few questions here. They said the process, number one, of forming the chemical energy of cellular fuels into higher energy bonds of ATP in plants is, of course, it's not photolysis. Photolysis has to do with the splitting of water. It has nothing to do, in fact, it is using energy to split water into hydrogen ion and hydroxide ion. That's photolysis. Now, option B says respiration, and that is the correct answer. So to produce high energy bonds of ATP is what we call what? Respiration in plants. And then C says autotrophism. Autotrophism has to do with plants manufacturing their own food. And then photosynthesis has to do with green plants manufacturing their own food in the presence of sunlight. Number 2 question says the process of anaerobic respiration of yeast in sugar solution is known as fermentation, and that is B. We mentioned that earlier, that the correct answer, I mentioned it when I was actually explaining fermentation. I said yeast is involved in breaking down glucose or sugar, which is a form of glucose, which is also a form of sugar, breaking it down into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and energy in the form of ATP, which is released. Number 3 question states, it said yeast respires anaerobically to convert simple sugar to carbon dioxide, and the correct answer is A, which is what? Alcohol. Yeast is involved to alcohol. Now look at the next question 4. They said a test tube containing yeast in glucose solution was suspended in a covered conical flask containing alkaline paragalol. Now the bubbles of carbon dioxide produced indicates that the yeast cell has what? Undergone respiration in the absence of oxygen. So the correct answer is also A. And then number 5, the enzyme of the glycolytic pathway are located in, remember we talked about glycolysis. I explained glycolysis as well as Krebs cycle as one of the the pathways involved in cellular respiration. The correct answer, the enzyme, comes from what? The mitochondria, which is A, mitochondria. And then the enzyme released during cellular respiration is stored in the form, the energy rather, released during cellular respiration is stored in the form of what? ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And then finally, the anaerobic fermentation of glucose molecules yields what? The correct answer, anaerobic fermentation of glucose molecules yields, the correct answer is 2 ATP molecules and alcohol. B is the correct option. Thank you for participating in today's class. You can practice more questions using your ExamGuide app. The app scores and gives a detailed explanation of all the questions at the end of your practice test. You can also learn particular topics of interest with different modes like study mode, mock mode, and even practice mode. It also has other features that makes learning very fun. Now, it is a must for all serious students. Download from www.examguide.com if you don't have it yet. See you in the next class. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, hit the notification bell, and share the videos to your loved ones and friends that will benefit from it. Bye for now.